Way of introduction, because people do tend to come late, so I'll give Wendy a few extra minutes before she starts. But just to say thank you for coming to this session, which is Wendy's opportunity to present to us about her research on the Higher Power project in Chester. More about that in a moment. Next week we're having our next seminar, next Thursday afternoon, same time, same place, which will be Professor Andrew Sims, formerly from Leeds University, past president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, who's talking about psychiatry and religion. Andrew has published widely on this topic, and particularly has a book on, a kind of counter to Dawkins, really, about why religion is clearly not a delusion. So if you're interested in all of that sort of thing, then do be here, same time, same place, next Thursday, and you'll be very welcome. I see that a number of you are new and not regular faces at our seminar series, so thank you for coming. If you'd like to get onto our mailing list and to receive news about these seminars, they're not all on addiction themes, they're on widely ranging themes around spirituality, health and well-being in a variety of areas. But if you'd like to know more about that, please let me have your email address before you go, and I will ensure that your name is added to our list so that you receive information about the seminar series. One other thing to say about this evening before we start. Addiction raises all kinds of issues for people, some of which are personal, and so I'd ask you to respect this space as a confidential space. What we discuss here stays here, and particularly if people are talking about personal things, if they want to do that, then please don't convey it outside the room. In case some members of the group do want to have that kind of a conversation, we've agreed that tonight Ji-Song will videotape the presentation which Wendy is giving and the slide sequence, but he will not be taping the discussion afterwards. Okay, so that will be completely confidential, will not be recorded if there are things of that kind that you want to talk about at that stage in the evening. The first part, Wendy has assured me she's happy to have it all recorded, so we've got her approval for that. And apart from possibly Theo, who's kind of almost in the camera line, I don't think any of you will appear in the recording at all. So you're quite anonymous, quite safe, as long as you don't speak during the presentation.
That's
right.
Quite handy, really, isn't it?
I'm not sure when Wendy and I first met. We've known each other for a number of years now, and I've been really delighted to see the work that she and others are doing in Chester on the Higher Power project. As some of you may know, this is a leading international piece of work really on the nature of the higher power as understood by members of the 12-step fellowships, and we're just so remarkably fortunate that not only is it being done in the UK, but it's being done within reach of Durham, and we can have a close relationship with you in the course of your undertaking this work. So Wendy is speaking this evening under the title Beyond Cult or Cure, the Negotiated Language of Higher Power in Contemporary 12-Step Programs, and she has an intimate knowledge of this area of work, which she'll be telling you about shortly. She's actually a woman of many talents, and actually has interests in Buddhist studies and other areas of religious studies as well. So we're very glad to have her with us this evening, and looking forward to hearing her presentation. Wendy, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks everybody very much for coming and giving me the opportunity to put my research in front of you. It won't be a surprise to some of you here that Chris's work on spirituality and addiction has been a great inspiration to me, and we've been privileged to welcome Chris a couple of times in Chester at our spirituality and addiction conferences in the last couple of years. So that's been great, and it's nice to come here. I situate my work, and I'm almost going to giggle now because Chris and I have just been talking about this. I situate my work firmly within the multidisciplinary field of religious studies. And for all the problems with the idea of that field, its boundaries and methods are delineated, I think, in two important ways. Religious studies is not just a branch of anthropology or cultural studies, and it's also not theology, although Chris and I were trying to work out why. I've worked most of my life in departments of theology and religious studies, and it's not a new experience for me to count a theologian as a valued friend. However, it is rather new for me to be having such a productive conversation with one, coming as we do from the subject of addiction and recovery from such different perspectives and with different assumptions and methodologies. The project for spirituality, theology and health here that Chris directs has a commitment to multidisciplinarity, not just in principle but in evidenced practice. I wouldn't be here otherwise. And it's also got a commitment to public engagement, for which theology has a venerable tradition. Whilst it's had a considerable influence upon religious education in the state-maintained sector and on public debates about multiculturalism and religious extremism, religious studies does not, for a whole range of reasons, have that same tradition of public engagement. However, I would argue that a religious studies approach to addiction and recovery has something to bring to the public engagement effort, and I'm grateful to Chris, both for his willingness to hear this argument and for giving it a forum in this seminar series. So, beyond cult or cure, the negotiated language of higher power in contemporary 12-step programs. In this paper, I propose to offer an account of some of the distinctive language used in 12-step-based mutual aid organisations, such as Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. These organisations are known for their strong conservatism in matters of literature and interpretation. I will draw on data from a large qualitative project being undertaken at the University of Chester amongst members of mutual aid fellowships to show that despite the conservative roots of the 12 steps and some persisting conservative discourse in fellowships, some more than others, the reality of the experience of many contemporary members reflects a more nuanced and personal, negotiated accommodation with the principal sources of authority than might be assumed from their historical roots or their literature. The picture inside of mutual aid 12-step fellowships reflects the diversity of religion, spirituality and non-religion evidenced in society more widely, as well as the shift reported by scholars such as Robert Wathnow, who detect a subjective turn in matters religious and spiritual. I propose in this paper firstly to attempt to explain why the 12 steps and 12-step fellowships see addiction and recovery as a spiritual matter, and to characterise the early spirituality of the first and largest 12-step fellowship, Alcoholics Anonymous. I will use the publication of the 1973 volume, Came to Believe, as a snapshot of AA's brand of spirituality in the middle years of its development, and then finally the data from Chester's Higher Power Project to reflect what I'm claiming to be a picture of contemporary diversity characterised by personal negotiation. I'll highlight what I think are the most interesting features of this diversity from the perspective of the professional addictions treatment industry, and suggest that these features may also be worth considering by the fellowships themselves as they negotiate modernity. Slide, please. So first of all, why is my talk entitled Beyond Cult or Cure? Well, I'm using the title of a well-known critique of AA, written by Charles Booth in 1998, sensationally entitled Alcoholics Anonymous, Cult or Cure, ? And indicating that neither of these epithets are helpful. AA and all other 12-step fellowships claim that there is no cure for what it understands, controversially, to be the illness of addiction. Only a daily reprieve, dependent on maintaining a fit spiritual condition. Any suggestion that 12-step mutual aid offers a cure is a misrepresentation. Furthermore, not only does the key text of Alcoholics Anonymous claim that AA does not have a cure, neither does it have the monopoly on knowledge about alcoholism. What about the cult charge? Since groups are independent, except in matters affecting other groups, there are no leaders, and people in service positions can only serve for set periods of time, the opportunity for charismatic authority figures to thrive is limited. It's not entirely impossible for them to do so, but it's not the norm. I recently made an inquiry to the LSE-based organisation Inform, who supply the government and other inquirers with objective information about minority organisations, especially those with the potential to cause harm. And they do have a list of inquiries and complaints about AA and other 12-step groups. In the last 2 decades, there have been 12, the last one being in 2009, and that's in the context of a membership of 2 to 3 million people worldwide. But the majority of these complaints or queries seem to relate to particular non-standard interpretations or subgroups that have emerged at different points. Plus there was a claim from a former member that AA is cult-like, but that claim came in immediately after the publication of an article in The Independent in 1998 about this volume. So I leave you to draw your own conclusions. So if the 12 steps don't offer a cure, and there's little or no justification for the use of the term cult to describe 12-step fellowships, what are they? Slide, please. Thanks, Chris. The co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob Smith, both alcoholics and associated with the Oxford Group, met during the Great Depression in the United States. Despite Dr. Bob's piety and Bill Wilson's own life-changing religious experience, they were, according to tradition, only able to stay sober through their contact with each other and their work with other alcoholics. Together, and with the early members, they developed the 12 steps, namely the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, which was adopted by Narcotics Anonymous and the dozens of other 12-step fellowships worldwide. And on your handout, you've got the 12 steps. If I could have the next slide, thanks. The Oxford Group, which provided the platform for the development of the 12 steps, was founded by Frank Buckman in the USA. It was a form of individualistic American prosperity gospel style evangelism which targeted the educated and wealthy, and there he is pictured with Mae West. The Oxford Group was strong in the 1920s and 30s. They later became moral rearmament, famous for Mary Whitehouse, and the tennis player Bunny Austin was a member of moral rearmament, and known for their 4 absolutes of honesty, purity, unselfishness and love. Whilst early AA took forward some features of Oxford Group belief and practice, they quickly abandoned formal connections and claimed influence from a variety of other sources, in particular the work of William James and Carl Jung, and several writers influenced by New Thought religion. Slide, please. The claim for a spiritual dimension to addiction and recovery centres on the concept of powerlessness. At least it does in the context of the 12 steps. The 12 steps understand addicts and alcoholics to be powerless over a substance or behaviour which causes them and or their loved ones harm. Some addicts are aware that they're powerless. The experience is intense, a desperate desire not to drink or use, but an absolute inability to abstain, even when they know it puts their well-being or their life or the lives of others at risk. Think of the young parent who leaves a small child at home alone whilst they go out to school. It's inadequate to conclude that they are merely irresponsible and inaccurate to say they don't love the child. The fact is, the drive to use is stronger than any other, so questions of agency must be framed differently. For others, the experience of powerlessness is hedged about with denial. I could stop if I wanted to. Minimisation. It's not that bad, I'll stop if it becomes a problem. And justification. A drink is the only thing that helps me cope. The 12 steps see these thought forms as mechanisms which keep the alcoholic drinking and only disguise the reality of powerlessness. So if powerlessness is the primary experiential condition of addiction, and if abstinence is to occur, some kind of power beyond normal willpower is, of necessity, required. For Wilson and Smith, unable to live abstinently after decades of destructive alcohol abuse, the power needed was unquestionably divine, the God of Christianity, but only when combined with community with other alcoholics. The next slide. The main text, the book after which the fellowship was named, Alcoholics Anonymous, known fondly by members as the Big Book, lays out what it calls 3 pertinent ideas. Here they are. These are in the 3rd person plural because the Big Book is presented as a historical document reporting the experiences of the early members of AA. It's also in line with AA rhetoric that people only recover in communities, not as individuals using willpower. Members will say it's a we program, not an I program. So these are the 3 pertinent ideas which appear in the Big Book. A, that we were alcoholic and could not manage our own lives. B, that probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism. And C, that God could and would if he were sought. Whilst this seems to engage the language of religious conversion, other passages in the Big Book talk of a psychic or personality change required for the development of sobriety. Even within the main text of AA, there is, I think, an unresolved yet potentially creative tension regarding the precise nature of the change necessary for abstinence to be achieved. Emphasising personality change and William James's educational variety of spiritual experience over the so-called hot flash, dramatic type experience had by Bill Wilson, many early members felt the organisation was doing itself no favours by retaining an overt link with the Oxford group. They soon claimed that God need not be the God of organised religion or theology, only that there must be reliance on a power greater than the self. Thus, whilst the phrase God as we understand him is retained, the term higher power is also found frequently in much of the AA literature that went on to influence the numerous other fellowships. The Oxford group baggage was replaced by what Chris Cook describes as a general wariness of organised religion. This is made explicit in the preamble, which you've got on your handouts, read at every AA meeting, which announces independence from sect, denomination, politics, organisation or institution. Crucially, AA is financially independent and committed to a principle of corporate poverty. So that is another thing that helps it contradict the cult charge, but it also means that the fellowship of AA can never be kind of linked to a particular religious tradition or a particular part of the treatment industry. It's entirely independent. With its freedom from the Oxford group and autonomy assigned to the individual to interpret higher power in personal ways, AA's numbers grew steadily. Today there's an estimated 2 to 3 million members worldwide, 40,000 of which are in the UK, making the practice of 12-step spirituality nearly as numerous here as people identifying with paganism, and much more numerous, than most smaller groups. They are underreported in academic literature on the contemporary spiritual landscape. You see lots of books about paganism. Don't see so many books about 12-step spirituality. They're underreported, I think, largely due to their anonymous nature. Anonymity is seen as a spiritual principle, not only protecting the newcomer, but also ensuring that no individuals may speak for the fellowships, thus guarding against the pitfalls of spiritual pride for the individual and protecting the fellowships from the negative publicity that association with individuals may bring, especially given every addict or alcoholic in recovery is seen as at risk of relapse. There are, of course, exceptions who break their anonymity. We all know about them, certain celebrities. But in addition to that, there's also a movement that's explicitly opposed to anonymity, called Faces and Voices of Recovery. And that movement has influenced quite a few grassroots organisations in the States and the UK and worldwide. And these organisations argue that the practice of anonymity hasn't helped to destigmatise addiction because it feeds the shame discourse around addiction and prevents the establishment of role models for recovery within the culture. These movements are gaining ground and making very effective use of social media to spread their message. But still, most 12-step practitioners hide in plain sight and remain unlikely to mention their membership or their spiritual practices except in private contexts. This makes them difficult to study. And whilst they do appear in the literature on addiction, it's not surprising that they don't often appear in sociological literature on the contemporary religious and spiritual scene. AA publishes a very small catalogue of so-called approved literature, approved by conference, the body which represents all members through its service structure. Because of its rigorously democratic nature, conference is notoriously slow-moving and unresponsive to social change. Ironically, outside of AA, in the wider addictions treatment field, the publishing of recovery literature, much of it influenced by the 12 steps and other aspects of AA, is volatile and very, very big business. The slide, just to prove it. Oh no, not yet. I'll prove it later. I'm on AA at the minute, not the wider recovery literature. So in 1973, AA published a carefully approved collection of personal stories entitled Came to Believe, the spiritual adventure of AA as experienced by individual members. This volume contains 76 personal accounts, almost all from the United States, and almost all previously published during the 1960s in a regular AA magazine called The Grapevine. All but about 15 of these accounts describe the experience of a fundamental change beyond that of mere abstinence from alcohol, consistent with Louis Rambo's account of conversion. Some speak of spectacular experiences with supernatural dimensions, almost all speak of having found a new way of living in harmony with the God they had previously blamed for their troubles or long since dismissed, and lives have taken on new meaning. Spectacular religious experience. God is frequently described, he's back, is frequently described as Father or Creator. And they report feeling loved, forgiven, and unconditionally accepted. The term salvation is used frequently, and whilst Jesus is rarely mentioned, the language is almost entirely recognisably Protestant Christian. There are some exceptions, but it's clear that the dominant experience reported by American AAs of the 1960s was couched in the language of conversion to, if not Christianity, then at least a form of classical theism consistent with it. The 1970s and 80s saw a massive rise of the addictions treatment industry and the recovery movement more widely, and interpretations of AA's 12 steps in addiction treatment multinationals, such as the Hazelden Foundation, became couched more in the non-religion specific language of self-help, self-love, and affirmation. So here we go with the big publications. In the 1980s, the multi-million selling publications of Karen Casey, such as Each Day a New Beginning, Meditations for Women, and Melody Beattie, such as Codependent No More, took a modified version of 12-step practice to a new audience. These publications contributed to what historian of the recovery movement, Trish Travis, using a Foucauldian term, describes as a swarming of the discourse of recovery from its original institutional setting in AA into the broader culture. So she's saying AA's message has kind of swarmed into this big recovery culture that goes far beyond the 12-step fellowships. It's part of popular culture, she argues. And I want to argue that swarming has actually had what I'm going to call a pizza effect on the language of the fellowships, because many contemporary members of 12-step fellowships cite this wider recovery literature as influential in their recovery. Empirical research in anonymous fellowships is usually driven by an interest in what makes AA successful and focuses on aspects other than spirituality, such as the power of groups, the development of self-efficacy, social identity theory, and the impact of changing drinking friends for abstinent friends. With some very notable exceptions, spirituality is not usually thought by most social science researchers, to have much to do with why mutual aid is successful to the extent that it is. This would probably come as a bit of a surprise to most of its members, who often assert that it makes no sense to speak of a spiritual side of the programme, since that implies that there are features of it which are not spiritual. Part of the issue here, I think, is that social scientists are likely to define spirituality in terms of belief, whereas 12-step practitioners are very clear that for them spirituality is about action, so would count all the mediating factors to do with peer group and involvement as spiritual rather than sociological factors. If belief is prioritised and essentialised as the primary defining characteristic of spirituality, it becomes a little blunt as a tool of analysis in this context. So that's about some of the empirical research, not all of it, but just some comments on it. If I can have a slide. The research project I'm involved in, the Higher Power Project, is a large rolling unmanageable, qualitative project undertaken by myself and Professor John Stoner with an explicit focus on what participants themselves define as spirituality. So we're asking members of anonymous mutual aid fellowships about their understanding of the term higher power, what they think has influenced it, and how it operationalises in their recovery. We're not focused on efficacy, and we don't seek to make any claims about the reality of the experiences reported by participants. Rather, we seek to map the language used against wider research in the contemporary religious and spiritual landscape. So to date, more than 70 participants have returned a questionnaire and 50 have been interviewed. Though large, the project is not quantitative, so we'll not be drawing conclusions regarding the beliefs and commitments of the populations of anonymous fellowships as a whole. However, the data gathered is sufficient at least to suggest evidence of greater diversity in conceptions of higher power than is reflected in the 1973 publication Came to Believe. The table shows the membership, so the majority of people that we've interviewed are single membership AA, members of AA. We've also interviewed members of NA and members of Al-Anon, but it's quite common these days for people in 12-step recovery to be members of more than one 12-step fellowship, depending on what their life has been like. Al-Anon is the fellowship for friends and family members of people with alcohol or addiction problems. But Al-Anon uses the same 12-step program and sees the friend or the family member as somebody in need of recovery themselves from their experience of addiction. So we're interviewing Al-Anon members as well. They all use the 12 steps. GA is Gamblers Anonymous. OA is Overeaters Anonymous, which also has members with different types of eating disorders. CA is Cocaine Anonymous. ACA is adult children of alcoholics or addicts, so a similar kind of organisation to Al-Anon. So those are the people that we've interviewed. There are many other anonymous fellowships, and we're always looking for people to volunteer to be interviewed. So if that's something that interests you or somebody you might know, best to email me, after this event. But that's where we're at. One thing to say, we have a requirement before we'll questionnaire or interview anybody that they're 6 months or more in continuous clean time or sobriety, for all kinds of obvious reasons that you can ask me about if you like. But, okay, I'll have the next slide. So what are we finding? We're finding, unsurprisingly, that almost all participants said their higher power was essential or very important. That's not a surprise because we're asking people who use the 12 steps in their recovery. I wouldn't expect any different findings. About 30% of our participants want to tell us that they are religious. The rest, almost all of them, want to tell us that they are spiritual but not religious. That's the distinction they want to draw. And we find a very wide range of ways of describing higher power, this power necessary that is beyond individual willpower to achieve abstinence or sobriety or clean time. So people use the word God, they also use the word spirit of the universe, people use the idea of nature, universal love. People use 12-step fellowships and programs as their higher power. I think on the back of your handout I've given you some of the things that some of our participants have said. People do tell us that God the Creator or God the Father is their higher power. And one participant has told us that her partner is her higher power. And I'll speak about her a bit later. I think I want another slide. Thank you. Yes, lots of our participants have told us that they take the word God and they see God as an acronym. They say God is gift of despair. So they see they often describe it as a rock bottom that they reach before anything changes, and they'll say that actually was a good thing to happen. That was a gift that happened to them because it was the only thing that meant anything would change. If they didn't have that, they would just carry on. So they see something very meaningful in that. So God is the gift of despair, or God is the group of drunks. So they talk about being unable to find or maintain abstinence from alcohol or drugs on their own, but with this group, they're able to do it. So this group is a higher power. Or some people have told us the good, orderly direction of the 12-step program they see as their higher power. So God for people like this is not, the God of traditional theology or, of Christianity necessarily. Okay, next slide please. So several clear themes emerge from the data, and I've got a fancy clicking thing that I was going to do now, where each theme kind of sparkles. But you can do it, but it'll be a bit random. So the first theme, as we've already said, significant diversity across the cohort in terms of the definition. If you click, it should go. Change in definitions or experiences of higher power as length of clean time increases. Fabulous. So this is something that our participants tell us, that their idea of their higher power is developing over time. So Jill, one of our participants, says, my higher power has evolved over the course of my recovery from a theistic being to whom I appealed, and is now more of a loving presence that gives me a sense of connectedness with other people of the earth. So third theme, identification of higher power with religious concepts of God for some and explicit rejection for others. If you click now, we should go to another slide. So Jill, again, she says, I don't have to go to church. Click again. And this is Jennifer. So Jennifer says, I don't consider a higher power to be a personal being, anthropomorphic, nor an intelligent puppeteer in the sky directing the show. I do not conceive of HP, that's a bit of shorthand that people in fellowships use. Don't see HP as a Santa God who rewards the good and punishes the naughty. Neither do I see this force as working for some and not for others, as in there but for the grace of God go I. And this is very interesting to me, because that idea of there but for the grace of God go I is something that people will say in 12-step fellowships. If they hear about somebody who's relapsed or somebody who's been hospitalised or died or whatever, they'll say there but for the grace of God go I. But here Jennifer, as a member of AA, is saying that she's got kind kind of anxieties about that way of thinking. So here I'm beginning to build up a case that members of AA and other 12-step fellowships are also critical of some of the kind of standard language that is used. Have a click. So commonality in the insistence on the need for higher power, as I've said. And then the next one, difficulty in articulating what higher power is. So many of the people we've interviewed have said, oh, I'd love to tell you about my higher power, but I wouldn't know what to say. I wouldn't know how to describe it. And then we start to ask them some questions, and then we're talking for ages and ages. But if you click, David says this, and this I think is quite typical. I don't really talk about my higher power with other people. Part of this is because I cannot really articulate clearly what my higher power is, but it is important to me, so I don't want to debate it.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that kind of resonates with William James's 4 characteristics of mystical states and ineffability. There's some experience that this person has had that they can't fully put into words, but it is so important to them. Okay, so next slide. And then, so the final theme, diversity of ways in which high power operationalises within the recovery or life of individuals. So lots of people talk about how they should be dead. And the fact that they're still here is proof to them that something was looking out for them. Some talk about feeling that there must be a reason that they're still here. My higher power has something for me to do, is something that our participants will sometimes say. They also talk about the relationship between belief and action. And they use this term, giving it away to keep it. So their experience of higher power actually leads them to certain actions, giving it away to keep it. So I could have a clip like Hugh, who tells us, my wish to help another drunk is the key to my spiritual well-being. Okay, next one. In trying to make sense of the diversity of the data we've been receiving from participants, I've been using the sociology of religion and spirituality, which has drawn on Charles Taylor's notion of the subjective term. There are dozens of scholars that write in this vein, but one of them is the American sociologist Robert Wathnow. And he argues, sort of from the 1950s on, that there was a spirituality of dwelling, he calls it, emphasising habitation and place. And that's given way in the last quarter of the 20th century to a spirituality of seeking. And he uses this term negotiation as the particular feature that characterises this spirituality of seeking. And I kind of resonate with that in terms of this research. And that word negotiation is picked up by social work theorist Mel Gray. She uses the term late modern or postmodern negotiated spirituality. And it seems to me to make sense to see 12-step spirituality as a form of negotiated spirituality. And in the Higher Power Project data that we've collected, I think there are several, what I'm calling, for want of a better term, maybe you can help me with this, poles of authority. So there are various kind of sources of authority that people in recovery are looking to help develop their concept of higher power, but they're doing that in very individual ways. So these poles of authority, I think they might sparkle. Strong group norms, and expectations within anonymous fellowship. So if you go to a 12-step fellowship meeting, you'll see that it's quite structured. People don't talk out of turn. People don't interrupt each other. At the end, everybody seems to stand up and hold hands and recite the Serenity Prayers. Some people opt out of that, but it's quite rare. You know, there are very kind of strong group norms that maintain what kind of happens within a meeting of AA or NA. Sparkle, please. Shared performative language. So there's certain language that's used in meetings. There are particular slogans. Easy does it. Think, think, think. There, but for the grace of God. But there's also a kind of in-group language that people in recovery use to talk about their experiences and how they got clean and how they got sober. And these are authorities, yes. Literature, which is highly authoritative. So there's this approved literature, and you don't see any other literature around meetings. But the research that I'm doing suggests to me...
There is a censor.
Is there? Should we all wave?
Yes. Let's try
We're not moving enough. So there's this literature that's really authoritative, but what I'm seeing in what participants are telling me is that they read it with a filter. And filter is a term that I'm taking from feminist biblical scholarship. You know, and I think this is interesting. The big book is unlikely to be rewritten in a less sexist or less theocentric form. But pretty much every woman that I've interviewed, and also a lot of the men, talk about what a turn-off the language of the big book. I mean, it was written in the 1930s. What a turn-off it is. But what they say is they come to some accommodation with that. They drop the stuff that they don't like, or they interpret it in their own way. So they come to their own accommodation with it. So Jennifer, again, she told me, I toss out the personal God language or the maleness of the HP aspects of AA, and I replace those words with grace or love. And Ben, the next one, Ben told me, I describe God in the feminine because my concept of life giver is purported to the feminine of all species I know of. So here are members of the fellowships kind of doing their own thing with these highly authoritative texts. And finally, Keith, who's an atheist. Keith is 35 years sober in AA, and he says, with one or two exceptions, people accept my viewpoint. Many agree with it and are more inclined to acknowledge their own lack of religious belief. When someone like myself with long-term sobriety demonstrates that it's possible to combine atheism or agnosticism with the AA program. I use an adapted version of the 12 steps which does not mention God. I have two sponsors. A sponsor is like a mentor. One a devout practicing Roman Catholic and the other a high church Anglican. Both of them accept my views and do not love me any the less. Next slide. Thank you. Another pole of authority that I think is involved in how people come to their understanding of higher power is previous experience of religion or spirituality. Positive, or more often we're finding negative. So the next slide is Ian on God. So Ian says about God, I hated the fucker. All the bad things that happened to me in my life were his fault. And this being the God I was brought up on, Catholic. I'm pleased to say I've been able to separate God from religion. And that's actually a kind of typical statement. I hear that quite frequently in what participants are saying. Another pole of authority, I'm conscious of time, is non-approved sources of inspiration. So we've asked people, what has influenced your concept of higher power? And they've told us all kinds of things. Here we've got Sophia, who tells us about Ricky Gervais, David Mitchell, Jermaine Greer, the Force in Star Wars. One thing that she says at the bottom there really interests me. She says basically that she listens to people in meetings talk about their higher power. She disagrees with them, and she uses that to develop her own idea of what her higher power is. So, you know, the claims that people make that 12-step fellowships are kind of brainwashing people to believe all the same things, I'm just not finding that. I'm finding, in fact, the opposite. People doing their own personal thing with this experience. Okay, next one. Jane told us what influenced her. Jane's quite kind of high culture, so she's got, you know, some quite impressive inspirations there. But nature, she counts as one of her greatest influences. Just look at fractals for a start. Next one. So beginning to chart the things that members of 12-step fellowships read or see as significant in their construction of their idea of higher power. I won't go through all of those, but you know, just to say they're very varied. The Dharmapada is a Buddhist scripture. Eckhart Tolle seems to be very widely read amongst people in 12-step fellowships. The Power of Now. He's kind of modern, kind of spiritual guru who draws on various different traditions. But you know, Julian of Norwich, you know, really classic religious authority is Julian of Norwich or the Dalai Lama. So some kind of New Age stuff. Star Wars crops up a lot. The idea of the Force seems to be quite a strong notion. Okay, next one. Another pole of authority, and this I think is a really important one. The first person, personal experience of recovery. So people find that through going to these meetings, you know, that not everybody, it doesn't work for everybody, but for those people that it works for, they have this experience of being able to do what had previously been impossible. They're able to stay clean and sober. And they also see that happening for other people. So just that first person experience is an important authority in the construction of their idea of what's going on. So I think Hugh tells us, I see the hand of a higher power in the miracles of recovery I have witnessed. So that's a small taste of the data. And I hope it's enough to suggest that the language used by contemporary members is far more diverse now than was in evidence in the 1973 publication Came to Believe. It seems reasonable to describe it as becoming more individual, as members claim agency to define their own terms over against the authority of traditional religion and even over against the authority of recognised fellowship texts and performative language. Themes can be detected, but language is diversifying, and 12-step mutual aid meetings can be seen as third spaces in which the discourses of religion, spirituality and non-religion meet in open territory and a new culture is generated. It seems from the data that the shared experience of alcoholism or addiction and recovery is fundamentally stronger than the differences between beliefs about higher power and its role, so much so that evangelical Christians and atheists can find some language and experience in common. The Quakers are known for their wide reach across theism, deism and non-theism, but it seems to me that the reach of 12-step spirituality is perhaps even greater. It's likely to take the literature of AA decades to catch up with the contemporary reality of the spiritual diversity of its members. A new version of Came to Believe would be very different to previous versions, but it's unlikely that sufficient consensus would be reached for it to be published. Maybe I'll be proved wrong, but that's what I think at the moment. And in the meantime, new slide, second to last one. In the meantime, new groups are emerging which critique what they see as AA's incoherent beliefs about higher power. Groups like Rational Recovery and Smart Recovery theorise addiction differently and argue that a power beyond willpower is not necessary. AA Agnostica, which is a large, growing and increasingly international organisation seeking recognition within AA, claims that what it sees as AA's commitment to an interventionist higher power does not suit its members who are atheist or agnostic. It argues that its own meetings, which do not promulgate these incoherent beliefs, are necessary to enable the maximum number of people to recover. So ironically, whilst AA itself becomes more open and heterogeneous, whatever, diverse, from the ground up, those whose reading of AA emphasises its literature and history feel constrained and are minded to form schismatic groups. At the other end of the spectrum are organisations such as Setting Captives Free, who want, from a Christian perspective, to highlight the difficulties with higher power language, seeing profound theological problems with individuals deciding on whatever concept of God happens to suit them. God as we understood him is not the same as God as revealed in Christ. God as we understood him could be a group of drunks, a sense of the awesomeness of nature, or even, as Robbie Williams famously said, the ghost of Elvis Presley. I mention this because it's something Chris has asked me in the past. Whilst I'm aware of stories circulating in the fellowships about people who believe their higher power to be a doorknob or the light in the fridge, and I once heard of a woman who claimed to keep her HP in her handbag, we've yet to find a participant who wants to report this kind of belief to the project. Our most interesting participant from this point of view is the one who sees her partner as her higher power. She's been sober for 25 years. However, my sense of this is that this kind of belief is rare and non-standard, and that a recovering community would help an individual to explore the potential psychological pitfalls of this approach. Our participants, I'm a bit worried about time, I've got 2 more pages, is that all right? Our participants almost universally report that their notions of higher power evolve and change over time, and imply that they believe their understanding has improved, become richer and more reliable. They often speak about a transition from seeing the group as a higher power to something more transcendental. I'm interested in the value they assign to this transition, as it clearly indicates something beyond the merely functional. A higher power, like the group, kept them clean and sober in the arguably more difficult early days. So if the measure of a legitimate higher power is one that works, that works. Of course, it could be suggested that such a higher power may not continue to work long term. The Higher Power Project has been constructed so that it can become a longitudinal project if funding permits. But at the moment, the resilience over time of different higher powers is not something we can explore, except through the retrospective perceptions of those who are in long-term recovery. Neither can we study what happens when a concept of a higher power doesn't work. We're only researching people in 12-step recovery, not people who are in relapse or who have left 12-step for another methodology. Some of our participants have relapsed in the past, and some put that relapse down to an inadequate concept of a higher power. But we're not exploring people currently in relapse for all sorts of logistical and ethical reasons. So our ability to draw conclusions in this regard is rather limited. So what conclusions can we draw? The 12 steps and the language of higher power are not exactly secular, I don't think, though perhaps they are seen as such from a theological vantage point. But certainly the language is diversifying and becoming less obviously Christian. I don't think it's too big a claim to say that your average AA is these days much more likely to be reading Eckhart Tolle than Emmett Fox, and more likely to be reading Emmett Fox than the Bible. The worry of addictions professionals about putting people in an environment in which they might be forced to assent to some creed they don't believe in is shown to have little basis. Rather, they seem to be put into a spiritual workshop in which they have to build something that works for them, which may be less disturbing, but for some it's not. It's clear that some critiques consider the contemporary 12-step phenomenon to be incoherent from a secular rational perspective, and conversely, others consider it to be bad theology. I notice that debates around the coherence or otherwise of higher power language tend to assume that 12-step fellowships belong to a category of religious groups making ontological and epistemological claims. I think some, but perhaps not all, of the heat can be taken out of that controversy by understanding them functionally, simply as organisations dedicated to helping those who need to become abstinent from potentially harmful substances and behaviours. And finally, I would suggest that the resilience of 12-step spirituality may be attributable in part to the authority it assigns to personal experience and autonomy in doctrinal matters, anticipating as it did the more general shift towards the personal and subjective charted by sociologists. Thank you.
Excellent.